Hi, this is The End in Mind, Season 1, Episode 3. My name is Danielle Sterner, and I'm in the studio today with Mrs. Lori Lane, the Executive Director of Artios Academies and the editor of The End in Mind.
And just a mom and a wife too.
And
most importantly.
That's right. We're going to talk about, in this episode, integration. This is something that, I guess I hadn't thought much about when I started homeschooling. Mm-hmm. It just hadn't occurred to me to be purposeful. Now, once again,
right. End in mind.
The end in mind, to be purposeful about integrating. And this is something that you talk a lot about. Mm-hmm. It's a part of the Artios Academy's philosophy.
Right.
And it's kind of a little bit proprietary, I think, in some ways. There are some things that I know a lot of people talk about integration, but there are some ways that you've really developed this concept and made it a part of the philosophy and fleshed it out for those of us who get to take advantage of Artios and the curriculum that goes along with it, which is now available for anyone who homeschools. So talk about what is integration? What does that really mean?
Well, integration, I think, it's like two sides of one coin. Integration, first of all, can be subject matter that is integrated with one another. Mm-hmm. So when you're studying history, what you're studying history is also being tied in with what is being studied in literature, or what you're doing in a writing course is tying back to what they're studying in history, so that the projects are overlapping and it's all interweaving with one another. Even when you're studying science, you can be studying the scientists and the discoveries and the experiments that were happening during a time period that you're studying in history. So that's one side of it. And the other side of that same coin is when you can take what a student is learning in the quote classroom or in a textbook or in a subject and take it into real life and show why what they're learning matters, why it's important. Mm-hmm. That ties it to real life, and that really is where real learning engagement begins. And if we're talking about, really having lifelong learners and people that just love to learn and want to learn, not just regurgitating things for a test, but they really are embodying it and they're integrating it in their own lives, then this type of learning is really, really important.
I like that you said that, not just to regurgitate it for a test. Yeah. One of the things that I think, we talked about in our introductory episode, just throwing off convention and really opening our minds up to asking ourselves questions about what we really want for our kids.
Right.
And I think about integration in the fact that we have to start out with a plan so that everything weaves into that end. And when we do that, we have to answer some tough questions. So one of those tough questions for me was curriculum. Obviously, it goes straight there.
Right.
And oftentimes, I think that's the first questions that new homeschoolers ask me when I'm meeting with somebody who's thinking about homeschooling, or they're just starting out. Like, what curriculum? What curriculum should I do? What curriculum do you use? And curriculum is obviously a part of it, and we'll talk a little bit more later in the episode about that. But it's not just about integrating the subjects. It's about integrating the subject then with life.
Yes.
So it's like two phases of integration.
Yes,
integrating the subject, looking back at history and a base of knowledge in the world, and then looking forward at how do I apply this.
And you can even do it, like, for example, if a student is studying music, there is a mathematical aspect to music and rhythm that can be tied into. So it's not just the history part. It can be math and music, or it can be, just all sorts of subjects. It's a way of thinking all the time. Is how does this tie into something? Oh, look how it relates. Because honestly, when you look at scripture, God looks at life as a whole. And nobody's an island to themselves. No event is an island that won't affect people around.
Right.
And so when you look at life like that, then you start to look at subject matter like that. Well, this would be affecting this subject here, and it's all tied together.
And I really think when you look closely at a lot of the educational philosophies that exist, both in the homeschooling movement and, in other arenas of education, this is something that I think really is very rare and very unique. A lot of the, one of the things I love about Artios is that you've kind of taken the best of a lot of those philosophies and woven them together. And I think that's something that we miss in if we're just taking a classical approach, or we're just taking a Charlotte Mason approach, or we're just taking, if we sell out to one type of approach and we're not looking at the whole and we're not integrating purposefully, we miss a whole lot. We miss context.
Absolutely.
We miss, what are some of those things that you found that light bulbs have sort of gone on for you as you've watched this philosophy with your own family and then now teaching other teachers and families? What are some of the things that you think are unique about taking that subject integration, which many curriculums do and many programs do? But I think they often don't go the final step of then helping the kids integrate that subject matter into life. So how have you seen that play out?
I think for us as a family, one of the reasons we began doing this, and again, you start on homeschooling and it's really a journey as far as what you're learning. It's not, light bulbs don't all go off at the same time, right? Okay, so
it's a progression.
So for those who are just starting out homeschooling, this is a journey.
Good
21, 22 years now.
Right.
But one thing that I realized for us is we had some learning differences that we were dealing with right up front. And we began to do this integration simply to help one of our children be able to know what file folders to put information in or what hooks to hang this information on. Okay. Because throwing random facts at him was like,
just didn't work.
Right. So if we gave him, this relates to this, so let's put it on this hook. He was really the one that showed us by how he was learning and lights going off. Wow, this is powerful. Then I did some research when I was working on my master's degree on integrated learning. And we ran a test with 240 students that were involved in a program similar to Artios. And we got responses back from parents, and what we found was, as we were looking for involvement in the classroom and engagement in the activities there, were the difference between students that were studying the same type of thing at home in the same way and the students that were being taught from a more traditional standpoint. And what we found were that the students that were being taught in an integrated format at home, rotating around kind of what we were already doing at Artios, had a much higher level of engagement and involvement and retention on what they were learning. So it's a powerful tool for learning, both for people with LD issues and people, just who just want to be able to retain it and understand the concepts.
That is something that, having had a traditional education for most of my life, I was sharing with you earlier that I was private school for elementary school, homeschooled for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, so middle school. And then we made the conscious choice to move into a public high school, because it was a family decision to be involved in the community. And at that point, I was pretty missional, even as a young high schooler, and understood that. But I really missed that integration. And so then when I was teaching at Artios and starting to get into the curriculum and using it and experiencing it with my children, it was like I wanted to go back and do all of my education over again.
Yeah, and for me, a lot of the little details that never made sense to me going up, but that I had memorized to regurgitate for that test. Now all of a sudden had context, had meaning, had relationship with other things. So it was a huge tool for learning. And there are so many studies out there that back that up time after time after time.
But don't you find that, it takes embracing the freedom that we've talked about how much freedom homeschooling brings and can bring, and that even that freedom can be overwhelming at first. But don't you find that it takes the freedom, the confidence to live in the stillness and in the margin, to not have it all planned out, to not be driven by checking off the boxes or completing the textbook? That it requires that freedom to be able to follow the cues of the child in order to provide that integration and to stop and answer their questions when it relates to something else?
I think really that this is one of the things we've really tried hard to do, because I don't want a mama to be overwhelmed with that feeling, because freedom is great, but it can also be like seeing wide open spaces for the first time and, where do I fit in this wide open space?
Right.
And so what I have wanted to do and feel called to do is come alongside some of these mamas that are really wanting to do this type of integrated, individualized, unique approach to homeschooling, and provide them with materials that we spent 21 years putting together that had flexibility for me to teach both my, all 4 boys in different ways, but some of the same material, but from different perspectives. So that's really something I'm called to.
So how do you answer the question when someone is fairly new to homeschooling? And right now I'm thinking, I think it's just what we're talking about, but I'm thinking a lot about putting myself in the place. I'm trying to remember what it was like first starting out. It's been a long time for both you and I. But I've also been meeting with so many people that are new to homeschooling recently, and just kind of mentoring them, walking with them through the process of getting started. And so, I think the immediate question that comes up from someone in that position is, how can you teach the same content to so many different age groups? Because we're so used to thinking in a very age segregated way. How do you answer that question when you get that?
Well, one of the things that I like to use as an example right off the bat is history, because it is such a broad topic that can be taught on various levels simultaneously. So we may be talking, we may sit down in the morning when the kids were younger, and I would read from one particular book, but that really was telling a story from history of the historical time period. So I would set the stage, and I would read, and then they would go off and do age appropriate type of thing. Like one would have a book that was more on his level, and one would be having a hands-on activity that was reinforcing what we just read. So we were still covering the same topic, but I made the activity or the follow-up more age appropriate, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So give me maybe one perfect example of one of your young ones and how integration made a difference for them.
How integration made a difference for them.
Like we were talking earlier about the one that struggled with fractions.
Okay.
Tell us that story.
Right, that one.
I think a lot of people would benefit from hearing that.
Well, this particular child was exceptionally stubborn. I know nobody has one of those, but this one was his mother, now in a female body, and my mom thought it was hysterical that I was getting repaid for my own personality. But we had been going over fractions, and he just refused. It was not just I don't understand them. It was, this is stupid. I don't understand why I have to learn this. I have to memorize things. And I just was racking my brain. How do I make this come alive to him? Well, we had a history day coming up that he was supposed to have a project for. And he was totally enamored with Lewis and Clark. Totally. And
me too. I've read their entire journal.
Oh, yes.
The boring, long, unabridged journal. But I love it.
It's so fascinating, that
fascinating.
whole story. And I just have been amazing. Them as they went through and saw things for the first time. But that is not on topic.
Great.
I'll try and focus. He wanted to cook something that they had cooked and, like load up a backpack or something like they would have done.
Oh, yeah.
So we went and we did a bunch of research and we found these recipes, but these recipes were for like 700 pounds of, this or that they were going to divide among their team. And so I said, well, it's like light bulb went off in my head. Fractions. So I said, you can divide this out and you'd have to do it. He looked at me and said, well, that would have to involve fractions. I went, yeah. And I turned around and walked out of the room. Well, what happened was he realized this is important, and it was important to something that was important to him. And then from then on, math was a breeze when it came to fractions for him. So that's just one example, that really made something come alive to him. So.
I love the fact that homeschooling gives us the opportunity for our kids to embrace the purpose of learning. And if we really understand, when you're talking about integration, if we really are starting from the measure of our education being understanding and not memorization.
Right.
And I think that's, going back to saying what makes this philosophy kind of unique. I think that's part of it, is that, we really believe that we're trying to reach a level of understanding,
right.
not just the regurgitation or the
Right.
informational
Exactly.
download where I can spit out a whole bunch of facts. One quick story about how this happened for me, having just experienced Artios for the first time.
Right.
The first year, I guess shortly after the first year, so it would have been going into our second fall
Right.
in being in Artios. We went along to the festival that the kids compete in, the arts
Right.
festival. And on this university campus, they have the second largest, my understanding is the second largest collection of religious art next to the Vatican.
Outside the Vatican,
in the world,
yes.
right? So I had never been through that museum. I had not been on that campus. And we were walking through, and James was, I think he was 10. I want to say he was 10. I'm pretty sure, because I think he said he started Artios when he was about 8. So I think he's about 10. And we were walking through, and he started describing to me all the techniques in this fine art. Oh, Mom, this is elongation. And do you know why they use that? Oh, Mom, this is Madonna and Child. And it was like I had my own little art
Your little docent.
curator
Yep.
in my own child. And
Right.
I just, my jaw dropped. I don't think I'm often super surprised. I just was thoroughly, deeply surprised and fulfilled
Right.
at the idea that somehow this idea of integration had made something stick to him. He was remembering facts that I probably memorized 3 and 4 times over. I'd probably seen
Right.
that painting of Madonna and Child several times in my education and
Right,
life,
right.
up through college. But
He had a context
he
for
had
it.
a context for
Yes.
it that I never did.
Right.
And it meant something to him. And he will remember that forever.
Right.
And the joy of that and watching that happen is there's a depth to that kind of education that I tell people all the time: quality over quantity. I care a lot less about how many facts my kids can spit out and more about what they understand. And I think that's what you're talking
Absolutely.
about with
Yeah,
where
for sure.
integration leads.
For sure. And that's exactly how it's done. I mean, the how of this is finding the common thread. And for us, a lot of time that has been history.
Mm-hmm.
For example, this year we're in the modern time period, and we were just studying the Civil War. And the kids were reading Uncle Tom's Cabin at the same time. And they were, learning about, from a scientific standpoint, the telegraph, which played such a huge role in Abraham Lincoln's ability to know what was going on with the enemy at that time.
Yep.
And so just tying it all together. And then, they were learning music from the Civil War, and they were learning what was going on in theater, because
Right.
I mean, it was just, and watching light bulbs go off. And even from a worldview perspective, that's a huge way, a very strong way of being able to teach your students.
Very cool.
So-
Well, thank you for sharing
Yes.
today about integration. Some things we've talked about in this episode we'll visit in other episodes in more depth.
Gotcha.
But for today, appreciate it.
All right.
It's good.